Welcome to the program today. Mondo Gonzales here in studio, and I have with me Keelan, all the way from England. And many of you will remember some of our previous episodes, but if you haven't, make sure to go to our YouTube channel and scroll down or just type in Graham's name, and you'll see we've been discussing really the kind of like the past, present, and the future of the nation of Israel, the city of Jerusalem. Salvation as it relates to Jesus being really the epitome of Israel, and also what we look forward to. And God has a lot to say, and there's a lot of theological understanding, and many of you have enjoyed these conversations as it relates to understanding the continuity between what God started with the person of Abraham all the way to the person of Jesus in the first century. And here we are living in an age. Well, now we're living in a different age as it relates to Israel being back in the land. But what was God doing through the people of Israel in the first century? Also, the judgment that landed on in AD 70 with the temple being destroyed. We've talked a little bit about that. But what we want to do now is kind of trace the history, how God has not abandoned the Jews. That they will always be the covenant people of God. And also the covenants, what that means as well, and what it looks like through church history. And so to me, this is a fascinating conversation that we're having. We're going to get into some of the details of how God has moved, and also the centrality of the land. We've talked before about whose land is it? Well, it's God's land. It's not even specifically Abraham's land or Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob's land or Israel. It is because he gave it to him. But ultimately, this is God's land, and he has the plan and the story of redemption. And so we're going to continue to get into that. But Graham, welcome back. Here we are.
Thank you, Mondo, once again, to continue the journey.
Yeah, this is good. And this particular really title, maybe you can give us your own recap as well. Today, Desolation and Restoration. So, you've been, again, whether you are an official historian or not, a professional historian, you are a historian. I've had many conversations, long conversations with you. I know that you know your history as well. And certainly we've talked about as it relates to England, and we're going to get into more of that at some of the other segments, but kind of lay the groundwork for where we've been and where you want to go today.
Okay, thank you, Mondo. So welcome to the listeners again. I hope you're enjoying our conversations. We're just chatting and letting you in on our chat. So yeah, so the last time we did a session, we spoke about Jerusalem, like you said, AD 70, why it was left desolate, and it was left in a right old mess. Wasn't it, in AD 70? And there were reasons for that. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to connect with the story rather than with any particular theology, right? So I'm not invested in any model, by the way. I just, to say that. One thing I learned, Mondo, from the late Dr. Heise, I know we've both enjoyed his work, was just what does the text say? Just stay with the text. And I think what we want to try to do is just, regardless of it might be strange to our ears or we've not thought about that before, is just to read through the text and understand this covenantal mystery of Israel. So what did we spoke about Jerusalem, right, and how it was the city of witness. And Jesus is the witness who came from the skies, and he comes to the city of witness, going back to Melchizedek, which is the city of righteousness and peace. But Jerusalem refused to witness when he came, right? So the city of witness refuses to be the witness. And so from that moment, then judgment comes and desolations would ensue. And we're going to look at we're going to do a massive sweep now through history. I'm just going to pull out some facts, I think, to help us along the way. So just for everybody again, I'm just referencing this book here, Jerusalem, Simon Sebag Montefiore. Excellent. If you really want to delve into it, go ahead and buy that. You can get it on Amazon. There's a plug for him, but excellent book, Jewish chap. So as you can tell by his name. So this is what. So basically, the city is cast out. in the way that they cast out the sun, the city now will be cast out. The same judgment now comes upon her. So if we just look at this scripture in Jeremiah, this is what God says, Jeremiah 32, 31 to 33. This city has aroused my anger and wrath from the day it was built to this day, so that I will remove it from my sight because of all the evil of the children of Israel and the children of Judah that they did to provoke me to anger. You talk about Jerusalem. Their kings and their officials, their priests and their prophets, the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They have turned to me their back and not their face. And though I have taught them persistently, and we could say personally, they have not listened to receive instruction. And then Hosea, because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being priests for me. Because you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. This is what Jesus prophesied. Remember, they're weeping as he's being led to the cross, and don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. And then he said to them when he wept over the city, he said, you know, your children will be desolate within you. You know, so this is a generational thing that Jesus understands, and it breaks his heart, and he weeps over the city because this is the city of witness. Isaiah says the same thing, right? So your country lies desolate, your cities are burned with fire. In your very presence, foreigners devour your land. I mean, just think AD 66 to AD 70 here. It is desolate as overthrown by foreigners, and the daughter of Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a lodge in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. Now, interesting, that's the very verse that Paul quotes in Romans when he's talking about that. So things are looking very dire for the city itself. But what begins to happen, of course, is that Israel begins to, now we talk about the Jews, the unbelieving Jews. Let's just because there were believing Jews in Israel who accepted their Messiah. But Jesus effectively had told them, you know, when he ascended on the Mount of Olives, he'd effectively told them, because they'd said to them, we'll get into this a bit later, but they had said to him, is it now you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Of course, what we know is the Messiah of Israel had a messianic mandate to regather the tribes to the city, because it's the city of the tribes, Jerusalem, and regather to the land, because only a few of the exiles had come back from Babylon, right? 42,000 or something, 46,000. And of course, this had always been weighed on their minds. Most of the Jews had stayed in exile. So even during the time of Jesus, there were Jews in Babylon, there were Jews in Rome, there were Jews in Africa, Jews all across the empire. And so what they're asking me, are you now going to, okay, you've left, you said you were leaving, now you're back. Oh, you're back now, so you're now going to restore this. And he said, it's not for you to know the times and the seasons which the Father has kept in his own power, but now you go into all the world. So Jesus is now extending his messianic mandate to the nations, right? And he's so we'll get into that later, Mondo, but what he's saying, forget about the city, forget about Jerusalem. You're going to be witnesses in Jerusalem, but the city's doomed. It will be razed to the ground, and with Daniel's prophecies until the end, desolations will come, war will come. You know, so I want you to refocus now. You will now be my witnesses. But what begins to happen is Israel begins to defy the prophecies of Jesus. So we discussed last time about the revolt, the Jewish revolt, 66 to 70, which really brings about the catastrophe. So that's under Nero and Vespasian. There's a second revolt. I don't know if you knew this. I did not know this until a few weeks ago, and I was just digging around thinking, and it's called the revolt of the diaspora. And it happened. It's called Quito's War, and it happened between 115 and 117. And I've just pulled this off Wikipedia, so anybody can go there and have a look at this. And it just says here, in 115, Emperor Trajan was in command of the Eastern campaign against the Parthian Empire. The Roman invasion had been prompted by the imposition of a pro-Parthian king in the kingdom of Armenia. So Trajan's army is advancing through Mesopotamia. And then Jewish rebels in its rear began attacking the small garrisons left behind. So now this is in the diaspora, right? This is not in Judea, because Judea has effectively been razed. It's been subdued. And then a revolt in far off Cyrenaica, I think that's how you pronounce it. So Simon of Cyrene, that fella, Cyrenaica, soon spread to Egypt and then Cyprus and incited revolt in Judea. So it comes back to Judea. A widespread uprising centered on Lydda, threatened grain supplies from Egypt to the front. Exactly. So this Jewish insurrection, right? So it just spreads very quickly through that part of the Roman world. And here's what happens in Cyrenaica. In Cyrenaica, the rebels were led by a guy called Lucullus or Andreas, who called himself king. So there you go, another false messiah. According to Eusebius of Caesarea, who was no friend of the Jews, we admit, it says his group destroyed many temples, including those to Hecate, Jupiter, Apollo, Artemis, and Isis, as well as the civilian structures that were symbols of Rome, including the Caesareum, the Basilica, and the public baths. Not only that, they actually began to slaughter people. The 4th century Christian historian Orosius records that the violence so depopulated the province of Cyrenaica that new colonies had to be established by Hadrian. He says here, this is him, the Jews waged war on the inhabitants throughout Libya in the most savage fashion, and to such an extent was the country wasted that its cultivators, having been slain, its land would have remained utterly depopulated had not Emperor Hadrian gathered settlers from other places and sent them thither, for the inhabitants had been wiped out. Dio Cassius, another Latin historian, he says, meanwhile, the Jews in the region of Cyrene had put one Andreas at their head and were destroying both the Romans and the Greeks. They would cook their flesh, make belts for themselves of their entrails, anoint themselves with their blood, and wear their skins for clothing. Others they would give to wild beasts, and force still others to fight as gladiators. In all, consequently, 220,000 perished. In Egypt, they also performed many similar deeds, and in Cyprus, under the leadership of Artemio, there likewise 240,000 perished. For this reason, no Jew may set foot in that land, but even if one of them is driven upon the island by the force of the wind, he is put to death. Various persons took part in subduing these Jews, one being a guy called Lucius, who was sent by Trajan. Now, there's some skepticism about this record, given that some of them strongly remind of the centuries-old blood libel against the Jews. So the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1906 has this entry in the Cyrene massacres. It says, by this outbreak, Libya was depopulated to such an extent that a few years later now new colonies had to be established there. A bishop of a native of Cyrene said of the devastation wrought by the Jews, so that's what he was saying. And then Dio Cassius again, he's an important source, but they think that the Jewish encyclopedia says that the numbers are probably exaggerated. But the point is, whatever was going on there, this Jewish uprising in the diaspora is exactly what Jesus and Daniel and Jesus had prophesied, right? It happens in Egypt. Let me just read something that happens in Egypt. Lucius led the rebels toward Alexandria. He entered the city, which had been abandoned by Rome and the governor, and set fire to it. The Egyptian temples and the tomb of Pompey were destroyed. Jewish rebels reportedly also prevailed at a battle in Hermopolis. That's apparently on a papyrus. Trajan sent new troops and subjugated them. And then the Cypriot Jews participated in a great uprising against the Romans under Trajan and massacred, according to Dio's, 240,000. So that's another uprising that happened. So what, 25 years, 35 years after the Jewish revolt. And then, of course, there's the other one that happens in Judea, which is the Bar Kokhba revolt, which everybody is pretty familiar with, and that's under the next emperor Hadrian. So do you want to share something about what you know about the Bar Kokhba revolt?
Yeah, I can give the background. So, I mean, for those that are watching, let me step back for a minute. Is a lot of details there. Let's kind of give an overview, because here we are as Christians, and we're living in America or in England, or maybe let's say I want you to imagine for a moment that you are or somebody is they're of a tribe, let's say in Papua New Guinea, and a missionary shows up. And a white missionary showing up to a tribal person, and they're saying, hey, we want to share with you the gospel of the good news of Jesus Christ, who's the Savior of the world. And you go, well, tell me, what is that about? And you go, well, the message of the gospel started in the city of Jerusalem. I mean, this really is a message that hails, goes back to Abraham, no doubt, but the message of the gospel of Jesus starts from the city of Jerusalem. And you might wonder, well, why do I care about the city of Jerusalem? And of course, that entails the idea of explaining to them God's redemptive story from the beginning, and again, in choosing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the land of Israel, and the whole history of the nation of Israel, and of course, Jesus' birth, his work, and he died on a cross where? In Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is very centered, but I also want to say this, that you said it well, Graham, in that Jesus said in Matthew 23, 37 through 39, that you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Jesus now has pronounced a very true prophecy on the leadership of Israel. But what do we see? What you said right, it's so correctly, is that they rebelled against that. And so, as you also said, that the early disciples, the apostles, they are asking, will you now restore the kingdom? So even in their hearts, they're wondering about the restoration of the kingdom. But Jesus says, it's not for you to know. You have a task to do. Go out and preach the gospel to the whole world. Well, they begin to do that. Acts chapter 8, you see persecution happening on the early disciples, and they begin to spread out. They begin to leave. They go to Samaria. They begin to go to other places of the area, and Jews living in Tarsus and all around, like Paul was from Tarsus. But so you have kind of this this two-lane highway of the believers in Jesus and what they're doing in taking the gospel to the whole world from Jerusalem. But you also see the Jewish leadership who don't believe in Jesus still trying to vie and to establish the kingdom in their own way. And so let's fast forward. We see them doing that, of course, in 70 AD, as you mentioned, AD 70. They get the kingdom, especially as it relates to the temple, is destroyed. But they didn't stop. They began still to try to establish this earthly kingdom. And Jesus said, look, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen unless I'm here and until you invite me back. And then, as you mentioned, with Trajan in 117. But let's fast forward to 130 AD. And now you have another emperor named Hadrian. And what Hadrian does is he goes, and he actually, we could talk about this, he actually at first has sympathy for the Jews. And he kind of has this idea that he would establish and allow them to rebuild their temple. And but we know historically that doesn't happen, and through a variety of ways, which we can talk about. But one of the things that he does is on the Temple Mount, he establishes a shrine to Jupiter. He renames the city Aelia Capitolina, which of course makes the Jews mad. And now they see it as an affront, and so they revolt. Really, roughly 132 AD, they revolt, and they actually have some very early successes in all this. I mean, the Jews were fighters. They had this lack of love, or they were willing to die for their faith, and they showed that, and of course a lot of them did. But they also were very zealous for the land. They were zealous for the kingdom. We believe they were misguided. A guy by the name of Simon Bar Kokhba was declared to be a Messiah by Rabbi Akiva. And so they had this, again, this political but also religious passion to restore the kingdom. But Hadrian comes in, squashes it, slaughters thousands, sends many into slavery of the Jews. And after this point in 136, basically, he didn't eliminate all Jews from the land, but he did eliminate all Jews from the city of Jerusalem. And if you were a Jew, you could not even step foot in the city of Jerusalem except one day of the year, Tisha B'Av, which was I wouldn't call it a festival, it was a remembrance of the destruction on the calendar, on the Jewish calendar, of the previous temples and other things. And I think Hadrian allowed that in order to remind them that they were subjugated. And so as they remembered this history, it was a sad thing, and he allowed them to continue to remember that defeat. but also that longing. So here we are looking at Jesus' prophecy. The church now is expanding into, I guess, again, Paul comes along. He's up into Europe now. The gospel's going to Egypt. It's going around. But the desire and the witness, let's go back to that phraseology that we've been using, the phraseology of Jerusalem being a witness. Now it's a witness of God's judgment afresh. Every time the Jews in their own power try to do something, God allows it to be squashed. They were getting ready to had hopes of building the temple again under Hadrian. It got squashed. And there's a couple of the things that they tried historically as well. But the fact of the matter is, Jesus' prophecy is going to be true, that they will not see him again until the kingdom will not be established, until they ask him to come back. And we know that again is at the end. But still, Jerusalem, it's like, Graham, it reminds me of the Old Testament in the book of Jeremiah. It's like this redo of history that Jeremiah, as you read, this God destroyed the temple, allowed the Babylonians to destroy the temple, and over they say, oh my gosh, when people walk through, they're going to go, why is that so destroyed? And they're going to go, well, the Jews rebelled against their God, and now it's a place of hissing, at least for the 70 years. So as we follow the history again of Jerusalem through the next time period, it stands as a testimony again to their rebellion against their Messiah. And for most of church history, Jerusalem, as Mark Twain said, who would want to live here? It's disgusting. So that's the nature of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Again, them trying to do something in their own power, and God in his providence saying no. So that kind of leads to the backdrop of where we want to go next. Graham?
Yeah, because because when you were saying that, what Jesus said was, your house will be left to you desolate.
Yep.
And you will not. So in other words, that Jerusalem will be desolate until you see me again, and you say, blessed is, and you'll not do that until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And of course, Jesus had said to them, many will come in my name saying, I am this, I am the Christ, and I am follow me. And, so we just a whole list of false prophets here claiming to be the Messiah, right? That Hadrian put a statue of himself and equestrians, on a horse on the Temple Mount. Well, there you go. There's an abomination of desolation appearing right there, isn't it? Because who is the one on the horse who will come onto the Temple Mount, right? So Satan he's doing his thing. He's just absolutely he's replacing the Christ in the city of witness. So, and apparently that statue stays all the way up there for hundreds of years, and then Antonius Pius, who follows him, he has an equestrian statue on the Temple Mount as well. So that was kind of rubbing in the noses of the Jews, right? And then even, I suppose, the Christians. But the Christians were really interested in Jerusalem until Helena. So Empress Helena, who was Constantine's mother. So let's just fast forward now another 300 years, let's say, round about, in the middle of the 4th century, 300 and something, right? Early days. So let's go to this period now. So, a lot's been going on. And then, of course, she is the great archaeologist, right? She finds stuff that so like in your dreams, Mondo.
In my dreams, yep.
She finds pieces of the cross. She finds pieces of John the Baptist. This is, of course, all with a pinch of salt, right? But no matter. She popularizes the city again, and so Jerusalem becomes a city where Christians want to begin to frequent. So okay. Because Constantine is actually now what he's doing. He's not only building the new Rome there on the banks of the Bosphorus in Turkey, modern day Turkey. He's actually called Constantine. He's actually building the new Jerusalem. So again, the inspiration of Jerusalem, which captivates the minds of Jews, of Christians for sure. and of even of the Muslims of the Islamic world, but certainly in terms of the Western world as well. We're all building Jerusalem in our green and pleasant lands, right? So anyway, getting back to our friend, the Eusebius, the Bishop of Caesarea, reading from Simon here, was jealous of Jerusalem's new eminence, doubting that this Jewish city, quote, which after the bloody murder of the Lord had paid the penalty of its wicked inhabitants, end quote, could be the city of God. In other words, this city's been rejected, right? It's been replaced. So Constantine, though, had to confront the heritage of the Jews, because he's the creator of the new Jerusalem. So he calls the Jews, quote, the detestable mob of Jews. So he begins to bring laws in, and he bans them from Jerusalem, except once a year when they're allowed onto the Temple Mount. Where the Bordeaux pilgrims saw them mourn and rend their garments over the perforated stone, the foundation stone of the temple, today enclosed by the dome of the rock. Prevented they couldn't marry Jews, Christians couldn't marry Jews, etc. So there's a real Jewish anti-Semitism. Now we mentioned this before, I think in the last one, that even though what we're discussing right now, this caused Jesus to weep. Mm-hmm. It didn't cause anti-Semitism. He loves his own people.
Yep. Let's not forget that. Yeah.
This should never have generated an anti-Semitic feeling, but just whatever it is, it's demonic, isn't it? In sort of in the church. And you could say, Mondo, that the first anti-Semitic treatise, the first anti-Semitic occurrence in the church recorded is probably in the Church of Rome, because that's actually what Paul is addressing in his epistle, where the Gentiles will begin to arrogantly
Romans 11
against the Jews, right? Because the Jews under Claudius, the Jews had been expelled from Rome. And so they'd had to leave, and so the congregations were mixed in Rome, Jews and Gentiles. Of course, once the Jews left, it was just the Gentiles. Then after some years, the Jews were allowed back into Rome, and the Gentiles were saying, we're kind of getting on better without you, or without you. So this is what Paul is addressing, both to Jews and Gentiles. So that's really the first instruction against anti-Semitism in the church. Sadly, it's not been heeded, has it, by the church over the centuries. So he bans intermarriage with Jews, and who he called a savage, an abominable disgrace. So it's getting pretty bad. But then this now gives rise to a guy called Julian the Apostate. So there are three periods that I can see where the Jews were either allowed to rebuild the temple, or were given permission, or work began, right? So the one you mentioned there under Hadrian, under the Bar Kokhba revolt. The other one is this guy under Julian the Apostate. Now the reason he's called Julian the Apostate, because he was the nephew of Constantine. And so when Constantine died, etc., and it passed further on. So we're just talking, 30, 40 years further on. Julian wanted to reverse. He didn't like Christianity at all, so he wanted to reverse the entire Christianization of Rome. So he would use the Jews to now have a dig at the Christians, right? Okay, so he's on his way to Antioch to invade Persia. So he asked the Jews, why do you not sacrifice? We aren't allowed, replied the Jews. Restore us to the city, rebuild the temple and the altar. I shall endeavor, he says, with the utmost zeal to set up the temple of the Most High God. The emperor's astonished reply was greeted with such Jewish enthusiasm that it was as if the days of their kingdom had already arrived. So Julian is like reversing all the Constantinian persecution and the Hadrianic persecutions of the Jews, and restored Jerusalem to the Jews, right? Returns their property, revokes the anti-Jewish taxes, granted power on taxation, and they're thinking, well, we'll take it. You're giving it to us, we'll take it. So he gives them permission to rebuild the temple, right? So again, Julian's rebuilding of the Jewish temple was not just a mark of his tolerance, but a nullification of the Christian claim to have inherited the true Israel, right? So the Christians were already saying that we are the new Israel, we are the true Israel. The Jews are and they've been, cut off from Israel for good. And to reverse, of course, to reverse Daniel and what Jesus said, right? Because Jesus said the temple won't be rebuilt; it will be destroyed. So he's kind of wanting to do this. Julian appoints. You know what? I didn't mention to you. Sorry, I will go back to this. But he appoints a representative to build the Jewish temple, and the Sanhedrin were nervous, though, and they thought, well, is this a bit too good to be true? And to reassure them, Julian, setting off for the Persian front, wrote, to the community of Jews, repeating his promises. In Jerusalem, exhilarated Jews sought out the most skilled artisans, collected materials, cleared the ground, and embarked so earnestly on the task that even women carried heaps of earth and brought their necklaces to defray the expenses. So they're about to rebuild the temple. So the Jews take control of Jerusalem. Julian invades Persia. But on the 27th of May, 363, what happens, Mondo? Jerusalem was struck by an earthquake that somehow ignited the building materials. And then there is speculation that the Christians kind of helped along with a bit of arson. But again, it's this idea of no, this temple will not be rebuilt, even though, what I wanted to, sorry, I just want to go back a bit because I missed out. I've got a quote here from Jerome, just to go back. So St. Jerome is the guy who translated the Bible into Latin, right?
The Vulgate.
The Latin Vulgate. And of course, he was working in Bethlehem, but he would visit Jerusalem and he couldn't stand Jerusalem, right? And he couldn't bear all their theatrical screaming. So therefore, he went to he'd go to Bethlehem. It's a quiet place just there down the road, right? But he visited frequently and was never shy about expressing his views. Now, listen to this. As an Englishman, this is good. It's as easy to find the way to heaven in Britain as in Jerusalem, he snarled in reference to the vulgar crowds of British pilgrims. So they have this idea here that, British pilgrims were already going to Jerusalem, so he didn't like the British pilgrims. So yeah, but I like that expression. Just hang that on your hat a little bit. It's easy to find the way to heaven in Britain as in Jerusalem. There's another guy, Rabbi Berika, and he just saw what was a tragedy for the Jews. That they would come in weeping and go weeping. They come in darkness of the night and depart in darkness. So that's kind of, and this is the picture really that just goes on century after century. The other place where the Jews did seem to have an opportunity to rebuild the temple was another 300 years later. In round about the 600s, and again they allied themselves with a Persian king. Now this is pre-Islamic, all right. So, and they 20,000 Jews, it said, marched from Antioch and Tiberias to capture Jerusalem. It's the Persians, basically. The Persians and Romans were always at odds with each other, and they succeeded. And apparently, I've looked at the figures, and it says that. They were anything between 10 and 100,000 Christians who were slaughtered, in that attack of the Persians and of the Jews that came along with them. Again, it's debated. Some people don't know whether it's exaggerated, but somehow there's something going on there. Okay. So he had a nickname called the Royal Boar, right? He's storming around everywhere. And so he says in 3 days, thousands of Christians were massacred. And the Patriarch and 37,000 Christians were deported to Persia. As the survivors stood on the Mount of Olives and gazed upon Jerusalem, this is the Christians now, a flame as out of a furnace reached up to the clouds, and they fell to sobbing and lamenting, dropping ashes in their hair, for they saw the church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Nia, the mother of the churches on Mount Zion, and the Cathedral of St. James's consumed by the inferno, right? So now it's the Christian turn to weep over the city, right? But then guess what happens? and then Christians are invited to repent, to convert, right? So we don't hear this, you see, because we only hear one side of things sometimes. And they would convert to Judaism or die. So monks converted to Judaism, others were martyred. The joyous Jews may have started to reconsecrate the Temple Mount, for the Jews now made sacrifices, and messianic fervor vibrated through the Jewish world, inspiring the enthusiasm of the Book of Zerubbabel. So but in 617, after 3 years of Jewish rule, the royal boar, this Persian prince, expelled the Jews from Jerusalem. He figured that Christians were better for him. The city was returned to the Christians. Once again, it was the Jewish turn to suffer. It's this backwards and forwards, wasn't it? Until the end, war, desolations will continue. Do you want to add on anything there before we move?
As you're reading it, it brings it up in the contemporary situation, in that with all the increased anti-Semitism that's going on right now, and we're trying to fight it everywhere we can, in the sense of a battle against this idea that the modern state of Israel they are not real Jews, they're a synagogue of Satan, they're from the Khazars, and they're only Khazarian Jews from the 8th century, and as if this is important because that theory, which if you go to our website, prophecywatchers.com, go to our articles, we have some articles refuting that theory that just refuses to die. But what you're saying here is, if you get into the history, there were thousands of Jews everywhere around the Roman Empire, ethnic Jews, but also there were still ethnic Jews living in the land of Israel that were not part of the Khazarian Empire, which came in the 8th century. There's always been ethnic Jews living in the land and around the Levant, that area, and they've always had this desire to restore, and they've had ebbs and flows as it relates to opportunities. This has been just like in ancient times. This is the land bridge between Asia and Africa and even into Europe. You have all these world empires coming, and the Jews are caught in the middle. But the fact of the matter is, this idea that the modern state of Israel was founded by Khazarians, there's always been Jews there. The immigration began in the 1800s from all over around the area, and to simply say that they were only from the Eastern Jewish, the Ashkenazi groups, simply is not true. There is a whole other group, Sephardic Jews, coming from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal, or really all around what we'd call North Africa, the Sephardic group, all there. So as we read this, we want to encourage people that there is this history, but also the way you said it, or the way you read it, it's a reminder that Jesus' words as a prophet, Daniel's words as a prophet, that it will not come to pass no matter what human machinations or humanistic Jewish efforts are done. It will not happen until Jesus returns and establishes it himself.
Yes, yeah, and I think that the story bears this out, doesn't it? Because let's skip 1,000 years, right? Because we don't have the time. But this idea, because after that, of course, Islam comes, And of course, other than the brief period, I think it's about 90 years, isn't it, where the Christians have control of Jerusalem again in one of the Crusades. I think it's about 90 years. It's mainly in Jerusalem's. It's mainly in Islamic hands, and it's fought over there. And of course, in that world, then for all that time, Christians are second-class citizens and Jews are third-class citizens. So everybody is discriminated against. But one of their writers, scholars, in his book of travels, says this noble Jerusalem has been the object of desire of the kings of all nations, especially the Christians, who ever since Jesus was born in the city have waged all their wars over Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the place of prayer of the tribes of Jinn. All right, then we'll go into that. So here's a quote. Have a guess who may have said this. All right, is connected with your country, right? And this was the view, you see, because from Constantine, right? Because his mother had popularized Jerusalem again. Oh, we'll make it a Christian city, right? Before the end of the world, all prophecies have to be fulfilled, and the holy city has to be given back to the Christian church. So this chap got a boat and sailed off to find the new world. Christopher Columbus, in a letter to Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Of course, he was a good Catholic. So this is what they, this is what they believed. It's just, the Jews have been replaced totally and completely. So it is the Christians who have to own Jerusalem. So, but let's skip 1,000 years, because I know people are probably a little bit impatient, because I'd love just to sit here and read the book to you all, but I can't. All right. So here's the prophecy, Mondo, that we're talking about. Of Israel's return, when he will again choose Israel and Jerusalem, right? So this is Isaiah. When the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel. And he who is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem. When the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the blood stains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. When, quote, the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land, and sojourners will join them and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob, and the peoples will take them and bring them to their place. That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's where right now the people would prefer to take them from their place. But this is where the Jews will be celebrated for being in the land. There's a prophecy where the Jews, it says that they'll take hold of, and they'll bring them on their shoulders, the Gentiles. We want to return you to your land. This is not what's happening now. And it's not what happened in 1948, or even though we'll get into the British history on the next session. So this prophecy is not being fulfilled either. We're just seeing the beginning of things. And then we had the Zechariah one: sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I come and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord, and many nations shall join themselves to the Lord in that day, and shall be my people. And I will dwell in your midst, and you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. And the Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. And then he ends that prophecy with, be silent, all flesh, before the Lord, for he's roused himself from his holy dwelling. The very same thing, by the way, that happens in the book of Revelation, right? There's silence in heaven for about 30 minutes, and nobody knows what it is. Well, if you actually connect it with the prophecy here in Zechariah, be silent all flesh before the Lord, it has something to do with this restoration where the Lord is getting ready to come back to dwell in the midst of the land. So, and I think this is what we're trying to say. All these prophecies are connected. We can't start in the New Testament. We can't just stay in the Old. We have to somehow see this story unfolding. So, so let's say 900 years or so, the talk of the Jewish return to their homeland would begin to be heard, but from the most unlikely of sources, the Christians. All right. So, and this is where I love this nation. I tell you, because what a story to be part of this story. Because it's the one nation that would be arrested by those prophecies more than any other nation on earth, and that would be Great Britain. And so another key date we need to look at, prophetic. All this is prophetic. So 31st of October, 1517. So does that ring a bell for you?
A little bit. Something about 95. I think the number 95 is in there somewhere.
Exactly. Right. The very beginning, what historians, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Now, again, I want people to hold on to that date. We won't deal with it now, but maybe in the next session we'll come back to that date. 31st of October, 1517 is when something happens, and in this Protestant Reformation, it goes off in some ways, all right? Not all the reformers move this way, but the voice of the voice crying in the wilderness, it is begun to be heard again about this idea about the Jews being restored to the land, right? And the first quote that I can find on that, I'm sure there must be others, is 1585 by an Anglican clergyman, right? Thomas Brightman urged the British, or the English at that time, people to Palestine in order to facilitate the return of Jesus. He's just saying, right, we've got to get to Palestine. Something's got to happen over there. The Jews have got to be returned, etc., etc. 1621, there was an MP, Henry Finch, who says, the Jews shall repair to their own country, inherit all the land as before, shall live in safety and continue in it forever. All right, so something is reignited with this Protestant Reformation, which is breaking with the Catholic model, theological model of a very, very much a replacement and an amillennial model too, eschatology and a replacement eschatology. And so these people begin to crop up all throughout history, and it obviously it makes its way into the New World. So there's a guy here called George Sandys, and he's called the first Anglo-American, and he's the son of the Archbishop of York. And he says the city was once sacred and glorious, elected by God for his seat, but she is now merely a theatre of mysteries and miracles. So they begin to actually go to the Holy Land and to see what's actually going on there, and they're not impressed with any of it, basically. And so Sandys there was horrified by Christians and Muslims alike. He saw them doing all sorts of crazy things. And so he's like a composer of hymns, and he was a passionate Protestant who revered Jerusalem just as much as the Catholics and Orthodox. And so here's really interesting, because what happens was when this nation then begins its Reformation, and it is different from the European Reformation because it's actually driven by a secular king who just wants to divorce his wife, basically. But God is still turning the hand of the king, and of course William Tyndale is part of that story. And so an English translation of the Bible begins to be put together, and of course we there's the Geneva Bible, and then we also understand later on there's the King James Bible, right? But this guy is around about 1610, and he dedicates his book about how the British, or you call it the Anglo-Americans, because England has just begun to settle the colonies in the New World at this particular time, and that becomes another voice. So this will be relevant to the American audience. That becomes another voice in this idea of the restoration of the Jews to Israel, right? So his Charles, the Prince of Wales, his father, who does the English Bible, it becomes the authorized version, is based on William Tyndale and others. And the Bible then becomes the spiritual and literary heartland of Anglicanism, England's singular Protestantism. The Bible became what one writer called the national epic of Britain, a story that placed the Jews in Jerusalem at the very heart of British and later American life. So this is when this story, the Zionist story, begins to resurface in the Christian church, right? So, it goes from Protestant reformers to Puritans to evangelicals to outright Zionists. And again, there's sort of major history in that. There's another guy. So Sandys goes off to the New World in 1621. He set off for America as a treasurer of the Virginia Company. And then he comes across another one who had been a pilgrim adventurer, Henry Timberlake. And just to mention a little bit about him, he had gone basically when the English started going over to the Holy Land, because obviously the Ottomans governed at that time, right? It's the same year that the Ottomans, Suleiman, and took over there. It talks about a new breed of visitor who was part pilgrim, part merchant adventurer. The Protestants had arrived. They tended to be English traders burning with hostility towards the Catholics, as they were, and often with links to the new colonies in America. When the English sea captain and merchant Henry Timberlake arrived, the Ottoman governors had never heard of Protestantism or his Queen Elizabeth, and he was thrown into jail next to the Holy Sepulchre. Well, anyway, this Timberlake chap goes to Virginia. He's also part of the Virginia Company, and so their pilgrimages to the new promised land of America were at least partly inspired by the Protestant vision of the heavenly Jerusalem. So this is why in America there you get the story of building the new Jerusalem, right? So straight from the Mayflower, it's William Bradford. He prays, "Come, let us declare in Zion the word of God." as he gets off the ship. And he's talking about the new world. So that Zion, America's the new Zion. It's the new world. And then, of course, then John Winthrop, right, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, believed, quote, "The God of Israel is amongst us," and paraphrased Jeremiah and Matthew to hail his settlement as a city on a hill. So we all know that phrase, right? America's the New Jerusalem. Soon there would be did you know this? Soon there would be 18 Jordans, 12 Canaans, 35 Bethels, and 66 Jerusalems or Salems. And it's like, they were just like, well, we're just going to, America became like, replace Jerusalem, right? Replace Israel. But it's the idea that Zion doesn't die in the heart of the reformers, the Puritans, the evangelicals, the Zionists. Well, you're an American, rather than me doing all the talking. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, what strikes me is going back even to what you shared as the reformers. We have most of the Middle Ages, from Constantine on, really the establishment of the institutional church at Rome, which eventually developed into what we understand now as Roman Catholicism, going back to pretty much the 4th century. That's when Roman Catholicism had its beginning. It certainly did not have its institutional foundation all the way to the apostles. That's just not historical. But what we find, though, is really from Augustine on, 4th century, roughly 400 AD, this amillennial thinking and this spiritualization. But the fascinating thing to me, Graham, is when the Reformation happened, there was a return, at least in one sense, to the literal reading of Scripture. A hermeneutics. Their interpretation was straightforward. They recognized that the way that the incrustation of the Catholic Church had completely encompassed the gospel, and the gospel was hidden. So they went back, and what was the root of these things is the Bible began to be translated into the common languages, German and others, even into English. But as we know, even before the Reformation, Wycliffe, doing in English, translation, and again, the Catholic Church's hesitancy and burning people at the stake for it. But once the Bible got into the hands of the people, and they were able to read beyond the Roman Catholic interpretation by the priests, and once it got out of Latin, most people didn't speak Latin, people are reading the Bible and they're going, whoa, Israel needs to come back to the land. I mean, that's what the Bible says. They read it for themselves. They weren't told this is what it means, but people could read it for themselves. And they began to recognize that prophetically speaking, Israel would be returned to the land. There would be a reestablishment of the kingdom. And it revolves at really this idea of all the prophecies that you mentioned in Isaiah 49 and others would come to pass in a very real way. And then again, we know that some of the eschatology of the Catholic Church made its way into a lot of the reformers. But in this, as it relates to salvation, they interpreted it literally. They interpreted all the Old Testament prophecies of Jesus' first coming literally. But that eschatology continued. But others were able to see past that and read it in a very normal way. And of course, then, when you do look at some of the Puritans and others that came to America, there was amalgamation of theologies as it relates to eschatology. And that's why some of them would say, this is the New Jerusalem, this is Zion. But yet, in the midst of all that, you still had those, especially still in England, that believed that no. See, I think England kept some of the more literal things as it relates to Israel, but when they came over to America, the new promised land, they allowed that other incrustation of theology to say, no, we're the new Israel. But again, I give England your history credit, because their theology stayed true to the literal reading, and of course led all the way up into the Balfour Declaration and other things that we can talk about next time. But at the end of the day, when we look forward, and here we are living in the modern age of Israel, being a nation, 1948 on, and we're looking towards the end of the age, it just reminds me that we have to keep the Scripture straightforward. We keep it literal. We keep understanding these distinctions, that our hermeneutics, how we interpret the Bible, is going to determine how we see the final end of the end game, so to speak. And so as you're reading that, it kind of just struck me. soon as we depart, we end up with some of these Jerusalems and Salem, Massachusetts, Salem, Oregon. I mean, I grew up in Salem, Oregon. These have historical connections to the Bible and the New Zion. So that really is important.
All right, yeah. So that's good. But even with that, I think it's still the fact that Zion is kept alive. Even in the renaming of the cities in the New World. Yeah, just some other quotes here, just to wrap up, because there's just so much. There's so much to get through, and we're not even gotten through it. So some that your listeners will be aware of. So this thing really begins to gather steam. I could talk about Oliver Cromwell. We can't really do that, but the Wesleys did this hymn. The Methodists were very much restoring the Jews to the land of Israel. So if people go on and look at go on the website internet and look at Wesley's hymn, the hymn to Zion, it's just amazing. They were talking about the chosen band that will bring the ancient race, no one left behind, but each impelled by sacred grace his way to Canaan find, etc. And then a guy, William Wilberforce, the abolitionist, he set up the CMJ, which is the first promotion of Protestant Christianity in Jerusalem, right? 1809. So, but there's a quote here. I mean, I can quote after quote, but there's one here your listeners will be aware of. Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon said, "We do not think enough of it, the restoration of the Jews, but certainly if there is anything promised in the Bible, it is this. I imagine that you cannot read the Bible without seeing clearly that there is to be an actual restoration of the children of Israel. Thither they shall go up, they shall come with weeping unto Zion, and with supplications into Jerusalem. May that happy day come soon, for when the Jews are restored, then the fullness of the Gentiles shall be gathered in, and as soon as they return, then Jesus will come upon Mount Zion to reign with his ancients gloriously." And I'll tell you, Mondo, I can go quote after quote, major characters in English evangelicalism and eventually Zionism. And just to finish it off then, because we get back to Jerome. So a guy called the name of Franz Kobler writes in his book, The Vision Was There. And here's his quote: "Nowhere more than in Britain has the idea of the restoration of Israel been developed into a doctrine and become the object of a movement extending over more than 3 centuries. Only in Britain have the leading spokesmen of many generations been inspired by the vision of a revived Israel. Only there the creation of a Jewish national home has been a serious and almost continuous political issue, which was finally translated into reality." It's true, it began with Oliver Cromwell, and it ended with the Balfour Declaration, and it eventually became British foreign policy to do that. So in one sense then, Jerome's prescient retort and prophecy, heaven was indeed found in Britain.
Yeah, here we are. And and as you're watching this, what we're trying to do here again is to show that the church has continued the mission of Jesus. In Acts chapter 1, he tells the disciples they're going to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And that gospel has gone out from Jerusalem, but also the promises of God have gone out too, because as the gospel goes out, it brings with it the word of God, it brings with it the Bible, it brings with it the history of the message of the good news. Again, going back to what we talked about in the beginning, is that if you're a missionary or you're a missionary sharing the good news of somebody in Papua New Guinea or in some African tribe, they're going to recognize the entire history of the gospel has with it, I wouldn't call it baggage, but the history of how it got to the good news, but also the gospel points to the future. And the idea of Zionism and the Jews being restored to Israel, that's really what we're trying to show, is that the gospel goes out. Every time somebody gets saved, they're connected to the story of what God has done in the city of Jerusalem and what he's going to do in the future. And we're connected to that story. And we're going to talk about that more in the next section and the next segment, that the church, every time somebody gets saved, it's a vindication of the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and ultimately Israel. So Graham, man, we're getting into a lot of it. It's good. It's fun.
Great session.
We have no idea how long this series will go, but the theology is rich, the history is rich, and it shows that God is going to vindicate his promises. So Graham, appreciate your time. Thank you guys for watching today, and be on the lookout for our next segment, which will be coming soon. And blessings to you. Thanks for watching.